Teaching with the Smithsonian. Montgomery College videos are a collection of interviews with Montgomery College Smithsonian faculty fellows, sharing how they engage and empower students while exploring the complex challenges of the 21st century, such as climate change, social justice, and pandemics. Fellows offer concrete examples of how to work remotely with the Smithsonian, artifacts, and resources. The work is adaptable for high school and college audiences. Be sure to visit their linked resources.
My name is Alejandra Picard. I am full-time psychology faculty at the Rockville campus. I teach human growth and development, general psychology, and social psychology, and I have been a professor at Montgomery College since 2014. The course that I selected to focus my Smithsonian project on was the course of human growth and development. Like any psychology course, we take a look at how the environment shapes us and affects our characteristics. For the human growth and development class, that is particularly true because we cover the entire lifespan from conception until death. And throughout the course, we talk about different environmental factors and how they influence different aspects of development, including physical development, cognitive development, and socio-emotional development. The students were required to do a course project that had 3 different assignments. The first one was a virtual tour of an exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum, specifically the Natural History Museum, looking at the Hall of Human Origins. This was part of the section where we covered our evolutionary beginnings, and this allowed students to take a deeper look at our ancestors, what has been discovered in this area of research, and to better understand how the environment has shaped the characteristics that we have developed as a species. After that, students were required to do a case study that was more of a traditional research assignment. They had to pick a topic related to climate change, so anything related to things like extreme weather or loss of biodiversity or air pollution, water pollution, those kinds of topics, and they had to select a population to see how that environmental change affected them. This was an assignment that was done from a developmental perspective, so students discussed and explored physical effects, cognitive effects, and socio-emotional effects of those environmental changes. This particular assignment, students were introduced to different kinds of resources that the Smithsonian has, including through the Learning Lab. So although this was more of a traditional research assignment, they still became familiar with some of the resources from the Smithsonian. The very last assignment was one that was a group project, and they were required to develop essentially a virtual exhibit related to the topic that they explored for their paper. Students were grouped according to shared interests. So students that looked at drought were paired together. Students that looked at extreme storms went into a group, and so on and so forth. And so they were required to work together as a team using the Smithsonian's Learning Lab to create a virtual exhibit that included any kind of resources that would allow them to tell the story of that environmental change and how people were being affected. So included in that would be things like photography and artifacts and video clips and lectures and pretty much anything that they could get their hands on that they thought met the objectives of the assignment. The specific exhibit that all students in my class were required to investigate, explore, and then write about was the Hall of Human Origins. This was connected to the section that we did looking at our evolutionary beginnings. This section in the book is not particularly large, and I wanted them to have a deeper understanding of our evolutionary history, and in particular, the fact that there have been a variety of different hominid or human-like species that have existed that have gone extinct. And I wanted to, one, bring home the message that extinction is something that can occur to any species, including ourselves, but also perhaps more importantly to see how significant our relationship to our natural environment is, that it very much has shaped who we are, not just in physical characteristics, but also behavioral traits as well. So as they explored that exhibit virtually, I had them consider and ultimately write about the physical changes that we went through in terms of our evolutionary history, the cognitive changes that we experienced, such as learning how to use tools, developing abstract and symbolic thought, language, and then also socio-emotional developments and aspects of our evolutionary history that we may be able to connect to present day, such as cooperation, competition. There's a portion of the exhibit that also talks about elder care and how some vulnerable individuals may have been taken care of by family members or group members. So I wanted them to look at all aspects of human behavior and human characteristics and find links between modern traits and traits that we may have seen in our ancestors. The Learning Lab really became a focus of the third assignment that was part of this one project. So for that third assignment, students were broken up into groups based on interests that they had related to the case studies that they had done. So students that were interested in drought were grouped together. Students that were interested in extreme weather like monsoons were grouped together. I know that we had two groups that were looking at the effects of fire. In these groups, students were given the opportunity to explore these topics by creating a virtual exhibit. The virtual exhibits the purpose of the virtual exhibits were to give students an opportunity to tell a story of environmental change. And so they were encouraged to use a variety of different kinds of materials for their exhibit. That could include research articles, but I really also wanted them to kind of think outside the box and to be a little bit more creative. So I also encouraged them to use artwork, to use news clippings, to use different talks that are available through the Learning Lab, and to create a collection that essentially told the story of this environmental change, how people were being affected by it, but also that identified real-life examples of individuals who are working on solutions. So students were able to put this together through a collaborative exercise, and they then were able to share their virtual exhibits with their fellow classmates, and they were given an opportunity to critique and assess each other's virtual exhibits. So this was something that was collaborative and in small groups, and then was also shared across the larger class. I think the student experience that I probably remember the most was related to the case study that we did, where students picked a specific topic to explore related to environmental change, and they had to pick a population to also explore and how that environmental change was affecting that population. This particular student chose to do an exploration of the effects of drought on farming communities in his home country of Honduras. And the reason why I remember this particularly well was because this student actually interviewed his grandfather as part of this research project. His grandfather, who comes from a farming community, who has basically invested his whole life in agriculture, has been able to see firsthand the kinds of changes that that environment has experienced in terms of increases in drought, and how that has affected crops, and ultimately how that has affected the communities that rely on those crops, both in terms of their own for their own nutrition, but then also as a livelihood. So he was able to put a lot of sort of personal story into that research paper, in addition to the research articles that he found and was able to cite. And this appeared to be particularly meaningful to him. He talked about, both in class as well as in the paper, about the sort of emotional impact of having these conversations with his grandfather and learning about things about his grandfather's history that he did not know. So for him, it really sort of brought it home that this wasn't just some abstract problem happening to other people, but was something that was directly impacting his own family and the community that he comes from. So this project was done during the beginning of the pandemic. Students were unable to visit the museums. They were closed, and so we had to change strategies from something that was originally intended to be an actual museum visit to something that could be done virtually, and for collaborative work to be done online. This was naturally a challenge for all of us, both students and myself as a faculty member. And one of the things that it really required for all of us was a degree of flexibility and adaptability, which is something that I absolutely was impressed by students' ability to adapt, to be flexible, to sort of learn a new approach to doing group projects and using a platform that was completely unfamiliar to them. And I was very happy to see how positive they were in dealing with some of the challenges that we ran into. I think part of that may have been because I was very open at the beginning and letting them know that I was new to this as well and that I was going to be learning along with them. And so that hopefully made them a bit freer to bring problems to me in terms of some of the technical difficulties that they were running into. And so I think that aspect of it was somewhat positive, learning to adapt sort of quickly as we were going through the course, but then also engaging in collaboration without actually being able to be in the same physical space was something that was challenging, but as we all know has become increasingly more important. And even in the post-pandemic era, we are still seeing that there's a lot of collaboration that is occurring both in academics and in the world of education as well as in students' employment. So I'm hoping that those experiences in the class help them to transition also in other classes as well as in their job life. I think one of the transferable skills that I hope students developed is to develop some comfort with agency, essentially being a little bit independent, doing some exploration, being maybe more curious, and maybe stepping outside their comfort zone. The project that I had my students do consisted of 3 different tasks, all of which were quite different. One was a virtual tour of a museum exhibit that had some specific questions that they had to address, but it also encouraged some independent exploration. The second one was a more traditional research assignment so that hopefully they got those skills associated with writing a research paper, using databases, reading scholarly journal articles. And then the last one was one that was much more flexible, more creative. There was a lot of opportunity to kind of make it what you wanted it to be more creative in terms of the materials that you incorporate and how you tell a story. And so I'm hoping that having those 3 very different experiences where the objectives, although similar in terms of the sense that I wanted students to have a better understanding of their relationship to the environment, they did require different tasks and different types of skills. And perhaps some students were stronger on the research part, but maybe felt a little bit uncomfortable with being more creative and including artwork into telling a story. And for other students, it may have been the other way. And so hopefully everybody got something out of those different tasks where they were able to develop a skill or gain some comfort level doing things that may have been less common to them or perhaps something that was less traditional for them. I definitely found that a lot of students are not aware of what the Smithsonian entails, what types of museums there are, the types of exhibits that they have, and a lot of students also didn't even know that they were free. So there's a lot of individuals I found that had no experience with the Smithsonian whatsoever. They may have heard about it, had a sense that it existed, and it was something that tourists went to see, but didn't really know what it was about. So by introducing them to it, I'm hoping that it'll increase the likelihood that they will actually physically go visit the Smithsonian. I did have a couple of students comment to me that they were really excited for the pandemic to be over so that they actually could go visit the Smithsonian and see the exhibit that they saw virtually to actually be able to see it in real life and explore the rest of the museum. So for me, that was really positive to think that perhaps that assignment encouraged more students to actually visit museums than they otherwise would have. The other thing that I believe a lot of students got out of it, and I certainly hope that they did, is to have a broader understanding of our relationship to the environment. We tend to oftentimes think about what's right in front of us, what we see every single day. And I wanted students to look at our relationship to the environment from kind of a broader perspective, sort of the macro level historically. So thinking about us at a species level and even before we were a human species, and how the environment shapes evolution and the characteristics that species develop, the process of adaptation essentially. I wanted them to really grasp the extinction level events that have occurred in history, sort of drive home the point that survival is not guaranteed, and that even though we may have all of this wonderful technology and civilization, we are still subject to the forces of nature. And to also look at it at a broader level, sort of cross-culturally and cross-globally, that a lot of people throughout the world are experiencing a lot of the similar kinds of things. So extreme weather is something that is experienced in a lot of corners of the world. And, regardless of ethnicity or culture, typhoons and hurricanes have very similar kinds of effects on people's sense of well-being, their survival, and, the kind of trauma that people experience associated with major climactic kinds of changes. For me, I think one of the most important lessons that I hope that students got out of the experience in my class is to understand the degree of interconnectivity that we have as a global community, that what happens on one side of the world can and often does ultimately affect us on the other side of the world, whether we're talking about human behavior or we're talking about the effects of the environment, that everything is ultimately linked. And to understand that our characteristics come from millions of years of evolution that is completely tied to the environmental conditions that we have been exposed to. The reality that we're the only human species to have survived to this point should also drive home the point that survival is not guaranteed, that extinction absolutely can happen, and even with technology and society and civilization, if there are massive enough climactic changes, all the technology in the world is not going to be sufficient. So while that is a very scary thought, I think it's also an important lesson to learn, because when people say that this is an existential crisis, that climate change is an existential crisis, that is not an exaggeration, that is very real. So I hope that students, perhaps those that didn't really think about it that way, may have now started to think about it that way. And the other thing is that throughout the course, we also talked a lot about social categories and social identity, and the connection between climate change and environmental changes and things like socioeconomic status, culture, and ethnicity. So seeing the connection between climate change and social justice, ultimately environmental justice, learning about how different social groups can be differentially affected by climactic changes depending on where they live, the kinds of resources that they have, and whether or not they are part of the majority culture or part of a higher social class. We also, towards the end, talked about possible solutions. So one of the assignments had required them to actually identify groups of people that are working on solving some of these problems. And so I wanted to also leave them with a sense of hope that even though these problems seem overwhelming and incredibly huge and really quite depressing often, there are a lot of people who are working very, very hard and being extremely passionate and really quite brilliant in a lot of cases in coming up with solutions, that there is something to be hopeful about. So I'm hoping that all of these lessons that they learned may make them more aware of how we're connected to the environment, but then also perhaps more motivated to be more proactive when it comes to possible solutions. I think one of the things that I was surprised about in this experience was how flexible the students were. We all seemed to just recognize that we were in an extraordinary situation because of the pandemic, that the previous rules sort of went out the window, and that to some degree we were going to kind of have to make it up as we went along in terms of adjusting some of these projects and dealing with some of the challenges that perhaps we did not anticipate. And the students were very flexible, very adaptive, very willing to learn and help me out as well, which I thought was really fantastic when I ended up getting stuck on some technical issues. So I felt that the whole experience was quite collaborative. And generally, I think we tended to have a good amount of fun, even in trying to work out some of the kinks that we ran into. So for me, I was pleasantly surprised to see how flexible and how adaptive the students were. My biggest advice probably for any faculty member who would take on a project like this, particularly one that is remote and is going to be done virtually, is to not get too hung up on how you think it should be. That is to say that if you start off with this plan and you've worked out every single detail, do not be surprised if you have to scrap part of it or all of it or radically change something in the middle or things don't start to pan out the way you expected. And if that happens, don't panic. It's going to happen. If it doesn't, that's great, you're lucky. But if it does, just stop and reassess and reevaluate. And for me, one of the things that was the most helpful, because I was doing a project I had never done with my students before, was actually tell them from the beginning, you guys are my guinea pigs. This is something I've never done before. So I'm going to be asking for your feedback the whole way. And that's exactly what I did. So I was continuously checking in with them to see how things were going, what was working, what wasn't working, what they were having difficulty with. And I would make adjustments along the way. So don't be afraid to change the plan. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable, to let students know when things are not going the way you expected them to go, and actually get their feedback and find out from them what they think as far as like how you should change strategies or perhaps what they feel most comfortable with. You might find that their feedback really does give you some guidance in terms of how to change or make adjustments or solve a technical issue or a problem that you were running into. As far as my teaching is concerned, I definitely am using more resources than I was before. So I've expanded the types of resources that I use. I consistently now show the Human Origins exhibit from the Natural History Museum whenever I cover evolution. So that's something I cover in my general psychology course and my human development course. That gives me an opportunity to talk to students about the Smithsonian and their museums and their exhibits and what they can find and encourage them all to visit. I'm also using more resources that I found through the Learning Lab as well. And I'm also showing the students the Learning Lab so that they can access resources themselves, either for my course or for other classes that they may have. So that's something that has definitely changed. It's just simply giving students more stuff that they can go to for projects, and then also adding that exhibit in terms of elaborating more on the information that I tend to cover in my class related to human evolution. This has also had a significant effect on me in terms of my own research. I've actually changed my research focus to focusing on conservation psychology, and what's called conservation behavior, looking at animal behavior with a focus on its application to conservation. So as my own research focus has shifted and I've focused on research projects down that avenue, that has also expanded my knowledge base on that area of psychology, which is something that also, I guess, shows through at different points in my teaching, where I will bring in some of that extra research or information that I know based on my own, doing my own literature searches, that I may be able to elaborate on those topics where that information is oftentimes not found in the textbooks. The fellowship training, of course, included a focus on the exhibits and how to use artifacts, how to bring in things like paintings into a class, for example, into a lecture or into an assignment that you may give a student. That is something I had never done. So my focus in terms of assignments really had always been fairly traditional, related to literature searches. So in doing research papers, by using your traditional kinds of resources. Now I'm able to sort of think outside that and actually bring in artifacts, paintings, objects that can help tell a story. And while I don't do a lot of that, I am certainly doing more than I ever did of it. And I'm still in the process of getting comfortable with incorporating some of these added types of resources. So for instance, instead of starting off going right into the lecture material, something that I have done related to this, my experience with the fellowship, is to start off with an artifact or let's say a painting or let's say a photograph that captures an event or a topic. And just asking students to sort of generate ideas about it. What is this telling you? What do you think you're seeing here? What do you think is going on here? What types of emotions do you think are being illustrated in this? And I use that as kind of a brainstorming or stepping point before we actually get into the specifics of that topic. It's a way of generating some discussion before we get into just the details or the facts about the topics that we want to cover, not to mention the fact that this approach can also be quite powerful in terms of, conveying some human experience. And an image, a picture, an object, a photograph can oftentimes do that in a more powerful way than a paragraph or a page can. This experience has been professionally life-changing for me because from this, another avenue opened up in terms of my research. I became familiar with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center related to the fellowship. The fellowship really solidified in my mind that I did want to change my research focus to something that has more application in conservation. And once the fellowship was over, I started to really explore research opportunities through the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, known as CERC. And I ended up getting involved with the Otter Alliance, the Chesapeake Bay Otter Alliance. So it's a group of researchers based out of CERC that takes a look at otter behavior, but in particular, we're looking at how urbanization and pollution is impacting the otters in the Chesapeake Bay. So that is a project that we're now starting to get off the ground and starting data collection this coming summer. It's also expanded into my learning about citizen science projects and starting to incorporate that in my classes as well. And it's basically like really changed the trajectory of the research that I've been doing. So it's been quite life-changing in a lot of ways. The unexpected outcome for me was to have research opportunities that I did not anticipate simply because of the connections that I made through the Smithsonian and learning about the research that was taking place at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. So I was able to make, develop relationships with researchers and also actually become part of one of these research groups and start to expand my own research to really focus on animal behavior with application in conservation. Well, I would hope that James Smithson would think that my project supports that objective and that philosophy. I tried very hard to open a sort of a broader world to my students, to give them access to information that they may not have had access to before, at least didn't know how to access or didn't know that it existed. I think the approach that I took in this project that I did with my class, where I had students look at humans and our relationship to the environment from a macro level, both in terms of our history, looking at it from a species level and our evolutionary history, but then also looking at it cross-culturally and cross-globally as a global community. I hope that that would support that philosophy of bringing sort of greater knowledge to individuals. Because when you look at us and our place in the world and our relationship to the world from that kind of big, broad level perspective, you really do realize that we are of this earth. We essentially were created of this earth, by this earth, according to the environmental conditions that we are exposed to. We are absolutely intertwined with environmental conditions. But then also, again, at that global kind of level, the recognition that what happens in one side of the world happens to us as well, that everything is interconnected. And I think that is extraordinarily important for us to learn as a species. It's very easy for individuals to become very focused on what they themselves experience on a day-to-day or minute-to-minute level versus thinking about things on a much, much grander scale.
This video was produced by Montgomery College Television on behalf of MC's Paul Peck Humanities Institute and Smithsonian's Office of Educational Technology. It is a companion to the Smithsonian's X-Course, Teaching with the Smithsonian, addressing 21st century challenges in the community college classroom. Learn more about this course at edx.org. Faculty interviewed for these videos teach at Montgomery College, a community college in suburban Maryland, just a subway ride from the Smithsonian Museums on the National Mall. Our MC Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship has spurred more than 25,000 visits by students and their families since 1998. Find our other faculty video interviews at youtube.com/Montgomery College.